My Wild Heart Bleeds with Yours. Written by Deadly Faith. Read by Arashi. Alhaitham decides that he doesn't like dreaming. Ever since the Akasha was shut down, the people of Sumeru have collectively started getting dreams again. Alhaitham rarely ever does, and he immediately forgets about them anyways the second he wakes up. He hates it. The feeling of trying to recall something that didn't even happen. He hates the feeling of not knowing. And worse, he can't even read anything about it. In the grand scheme of things, he doesn't see the point of dreaming. And, if it wasn't enough, he had started getting nightmares. Sure, only a very few things can ultimately catch Alhaitham off guard, or get under his skin. The people who have worked close to him would tell you that he seemingly owns the face of a rock, never really changing, no matter the circumstances. You would have to closely pay attention to the minuscule changes, the slight turn of his lips when he finds something amusing, the little creases in his forehead when he's deep in thought, or his body language. Other than that, the average bystander would think that Alhaitham doesn't feel anything. But he does, especially when his nightmares consist of his grandmother. Anyone, from co-workers to literal strangers, would know that Alhaitham is the last person in Teyvat who would care about pleasing other people. Everything that he does is ultimately an effort to make his life more comfortable. He speaks his mind, blunt and direct, like how he thinks everything should be. Although he's often described as an all-knowing asshole, it's just a consequence of his brutal sense of honesty and his own genius. Yet, Alhaitham doesn't care. Alhaitham doesn't care if you call him an all-knowing asshole, because Alhaitham does not care about pleasing other people, nor making himself pleasing. But he woke up one night, breathing heavily, forehead sweating, when his grandmother called him an utter disappointment in his nightmare. Why? This is the only thing that Alhaitham can even think of once his mind clears. It doesn't make sense. His grandmother would never say such things. She was always kind, far kinder than Alhaitham would ever be. She wanted nothing but prosperity and happiness for him, defended him when everyone else disliked Alhaitham for being unique, and believed him when no one else did. She understood Alhaitham when nobody even tried to give him a chance, when he was just a young kid with a too advanced brain that apparently was too much to handle. She would never speak to him in such a manner. That wasn't his grandmother who just appeared in his nightmare. But it doesn't comfort Alhaitham, not even one bit. He sits up from his bed. The sweat forming on his forehead and back makes his shirt stick uncomfortably on his skin. He digs his nails into his palms as he tries not to think about it. The sweat, the shirt, the hot room temperature, the ringing in his ears, his grandmother calling him a disappointment. His grandmother is disappointed in him. Alhaitham desperately searches for his earpieces on the bedside table, as if putting them on would stop the voices in his head that awfully sounded like his grandmother. They help, even if it's a little. When he gets the familiar feeling of a muffled noise, the earpieces pressing comfortably onto his ears, it calms him slowly. He tries to breathe, tries to count from 1 to 10, letting his fists relax as he lets go of his palms that are already turning red. I'm disappointed in you, my child. How can you let yourself grow to be so arrogant? His eyes forcefully open, his hands moving on their own, flying to his ears as if to cover them, only to realize that they're already covered by his earpieces. He can't stop the voice, can't stop thinking about it. He tries to make sense of it, how and why he would dream of the first person he has ever trusted to speak ill of him, of why she would appear in his dreams for the first time, only to repeat back the words that he has been getting his whole life from the people around him. He tries to think of any plausible reason, only to come to a horrifying conclusion. For once in Alhaitham's life, he truly doesn't know. He had read about dreams, of course, from scriptures when the people of Sumeru used to dream before all this. They say that dreams manifest from something real, and it's ultimately a reflection of things that already exist. And when you dream of dead people, it's often believed to be a sign of them visiting you, letting you know that they have never really left. Alhaitham thinks again, mine undoubtedly already coming up with the worst answer, that it's what his grandmother truly feels, and that he had turned into something that she would have never wanted. It takes a moment for him to realize that he's crying. He doesn't know when he started to do so, but he feels hot tears flow down his cheeks. He feels awful, his heart being constricted tightly in his chest, and his mind panics, because this is a very unfamiliar territory. Alhaitham rarely cries. He thinks he hasn't cried in so long that he forgot he was capable of it. It erases all of the logic in his brain, and for once, his heart rules his body. He lets himself be consumed by this terrible feeling of something he hasn't quite made sense of yet. He looks around in the dark room, blanket barely comforting him from the cold night, bed too large, even for his grown body, to realize that the feeling might be loneliness, something that he truly has never felt before. And to finally see your grandmother in your dreams after years, when all you had was a single picture of her safely kept in your wardrobe, and the already hazy memories of her when you were young, only for her to spout nonsense things that she's unrecognizable. Alhaitham can barely keep it together. It goes on like this for minutes, maybe hours, since Alhaitham isn't rational enough to keep count. He doesn't know when his tears have stopped flowing, but his lungs have gradually started to breathe easier. His whole body is cold, except his eyes, and he tries to gulp down when he starts hiccuping. He doesn't think that it's pathetic. Alhaitham doesn't think that crying is something to be looked down upon, but he does feel uncomfortable. So once his mind clears a little, he stands up from his bed, deciding to go outside and drink water. What he doesn't expect is to see Kaveh by the dinner table with his blueprints spread out. Kaveh looks up from the sound of him approaching, and by the looks of it, he was too engrossed to even hear the door opening from Alhaitham's room. Typical, Alhaitham thinks. But Kaveh's eyes immediately widen once he gets a look at his roommate's face. "Why do you look so awful?" Alhaitham knows that he means well, but it doesn't stop the slight grimace that spreads from his face. He decides to ignore it, going straight to the kitchen behind Kaveh to get something to drink. He thinks that if he doesn't speak, Alhaitham's unsure if he would even sound natural from all the crying he just did. Maybe Kaveh would just let him be and go back to his work. When he turns around after drinking, Kaveh has fully disregarded what he was previously doing, and is now looking at him with his arms crossed. His face is filled with concern, and Alhaitham is no stranger to this expression. Kaveh wears this face every day, whether it's toward stray animals in the city, crying lost children in Port Ormos, or struggling students in the Akademiya. This is a face that Alhaitham sees every day, but Kaveh rarely wears it when he's looking straight into Alhaitham. The younger can't help but feel small under his gaze. "Are you all right?" Alhaitham doesn't see the point of lying, fully aware that Kaveh will see through him anyway. So he answers vaguely, but still enough to explain. "Just a bad dream." He stares, like he's picking Alhaitham apart with a single solemn stare. At that moment, he's not Kaveh, who often gets drunk to forget about his own problems, waiting for Alhaitham in the tavern to come and drag him back to their home, to drunkenly throw empty insults at the younger for not understanding his ideals on the way. It's Kaveh, who graduated top of his class, who made no enemies, approaching every single student in the Akademiya to make friends. It's Kaveh with a heart of gold, his senior, who was kind enough to approach the arrogant kid in the library. "Do you want to talk about it? Going back to sleep in such a state will do you no good, you know." Alhaitham ponders, weighing his options in his mind. He thinks that there's no harm in being honest. So he looks at Kaveh, back resting against the kitchen counter with his arms crossed. He might as well release everything tonight and lay it to rest. My grandmother. He starts, throat suddenly tightening. She talked to me, called me a disappointment. Kaveh widens his eyes and mouth, always the man to never hide his reactions. It makes Alhaitham huff in amusement for a bit. That's about it. My head is clearer now. It doesn't affect me anymore. I know it well enough that she won't. Oh, please! Can you stop rationalizing everything for a minute? It made you sad, didn't it? Alhaitham expects to be made fun of, waiting for a remark from the architect about emotions. But it never comes. Instead, Kaveh looks at him with worried eyes, and when Alhaitham just stares back, the older man opens his mouth again. You cried. It made you feel bad. Kaveh moves closer to him, wiping the already dry tears on Alhaitham's cheek with the back of his hand, as if to prove a point. Alhaitham feels clammy. There's nothing more than that? You were sad and that's it? Don't tell me that it doesn't affect you anymore. Nonsense, when it did. Alhaitham doesn't say anything, letting the architect preach to him like he usually does. He realizes that he doesn't really mind it when Kaveh talks, even if it's an argument. That's a part of you that I don't like, you know. You're emotionally intelligent when it comes to other people, understanding their feelings even if they don't say anything. When it comes to yourself, suddenly everything's supposed to be rational. Let yourself be sad sometimes, Alhaitham. I see you are an expert in this area. Oh, you! Kaveh groans, rolling his eyes and eventually turning his back to the other. There's a small smile that appears on Alhaitham's face. What do I even do with you? I'm here trying to be a senior you can depend on, and this is what I get? A jab at my own miserable life? I wasn't pertaining to that. Alhaitham huffs, uncrossing his arms to stand properly. I was pertaining to me. You're an expert when it comes to me. Kaveh stops fiddling with his pen, his back still turned away from the other. Alhaitham suddenly hears an amused scoff from his senior. Well, who knows you better than I? Alhaitham ponders over the truth of that heavy statement. He stares at the open space between the fabric of Kaveh's shirt, looking at the bare skin. Only he knows that Kaveh has a scar on the top of his shoulder, and when you ask Kaveh about Alhaitham's scars, he would tell you about the one on his collarbone, or go back to many years ago, when Alhaitham had a scar on his eyebrow from the edge of a book falling down the shelf, hitting him straight in the face. Only Kaveh knows of that scar. Only Kaveh has ever touched that scar. Only Kaveh stayed close enough to ever notice it before it healed. I suppose no one else. Kaveh looks back at him, his eyes suddenly holding a multitude of emotions. The architect smiles, turning back to look down at his blueprints. So, would you believe me if I say that your grandmother is the last person on Tevat to even think that about you? Alhaitham blinks, suddenly being pulled back to the subject of his nightmare, but he no longer has an uncomfortable look on his face. I know. And you would also have me believe that the acting Grand Sage of Sumeru is the least person to become the subject of disappointment? Alhaitham sighs, and he can actually feel the grin from Kaveh's face, despite not seeing it. I don't concern myself with such frivolities. Plus, I'm being demoted back to being the scribe next week. Kaveh laughs, as if he was already expecting that answer. You'd better be. Who knows what would happen to Sumeru if you were the Grand Sage for eternity? Not approve your projects, that's for sure. You already do that as the scribe. Well, I'll be. Maybe it's a sign you should do better. Kaveh groans, looking back again to glare at him. But there's a subtle upturn at the corner of his lips, something that only Alhaitham would notice. Alhaitham throws a small smile back. Go to sleep. No more comforting words left, senior. You look fine. Alhaitham walks away, back to his room, a very big grin now plastered on his face. He doesn't have to look back to know that Kaveh is wearing the same one on his. When Alhaitham wakes up the next morning, he need not ask about the set of breakfast waiting for him on the table. It's a little bit cold. He eats it to his heart's content, like a man who had a good dream.